Wow.
Nice.
Yeah. Nice.
It kind of brings up the true story, which is that I didn't really invent it. I rediscovered what they used to do 100 years ago and put a new spin on it. And I think it just evolved because of all the concern about root structure and, container grown plant circling roots and root flare, planting depth and all that stuff. It kind of got some momentum, and I think Gary helped with that too. My first attempt was sort of I got some donated trees from Schmidt's, I think. I put them in a stock tank with a minnow bubbler in it, just to see what would happen. And they grew roots like crazy in that aerated water. I thought, well, those are water roots. They won't really do anything, but they were such nice plants. I decided, well, I'll just take them out in the field and plant them. By this time it was in July, middle of July. I think I put them in March. And so I just went out there and planted them. Gave them no particular extra care. And 100% of them survived. And I thought, whoa, this is interesting. I wouldn't have predicted that given the fact that they had what a lot of people would call water roots. When you think about it, not too practical because the plants are going to be flopping all over the place. And it's just for a large scale implementation, you need something that's going to hold the plants up. And so that's how I evolved into gravel, just got some pea gravel. And since then I experimented with all kinds of different additives. And I started with just putting in 10% sand, 10 or 15% sand, which sounds counterintuitive because you get this nice clean pea gravel and then you gunk it up with sand again. But what that does is add a little bit of water holding capacity to the rock. And so you don't have to irrigate quite so much. Well, if you look at traditional ways of handling bare root, the trees are harvested in the fall and they're put in cold storage for the winter to keep them in good shape. And then they're graded and packed and shipped out in the spring. And it's kind of conventional wisdom that you have a limited planting window.
So in the past in Columbia Heights, they've planted bare roots, but planted them in the spring, immediately after the order arrival. The biggest improvement over that is logistics. Having to plant 100 trees in a 2 or 3 day window leads to sloppier planting, in my opinion. The gravel bed gives us a ton of flexibility. We essentially have an 8 to 10 week planting window now. So I can have a light day with a 2-man crew if people are busy doing other things. You can even potentially plant solo, take a smaller number of trees, or if you have labor available, load up 20 plus trees in a day.
You're at the Hennepin County gravel bed here, and our system utilizes bobcats to install and remove the trees because we have such a large space for the gravel bed. We normally have 500 to 2,000 trees in the gravel bed, and installing them by hand would take too long. We get our order in and we need to get those trees in the gravel bed, so we utilize a bobcat to do that and for removing them as well. The problem with using a bobcat with bare ground is that you start to integrate the bare soil, if you have bare ground, into your gravel, and that's a situation that you really don't want. You start to create a new media with soil and gravel and whatever else gets stuck in there. So some parts of the gravel start to turn into cement after a while, depending on the type of soil that you have. Another issue that we have with pulling trees out with the bobcat is I need to put large amounts of gravel in piles as I pull them out. So we are going to be moving to a paved area now, and this paved area, I'll have to leave some area open for the gravel to get set on as I remove trees and pile up gravel, but it's going to be much better. The gravel's lifespan is pretty much forever, as long as, you know, as long as we have the pad there and don't integrate soil into it. We found that when the soil gets integrated into the gravel, that we have less root growth in with the gravel bed trees. It's less porous, not as easily accessible space for the roots to travel. It's my hypothesis. So we don't have as good a root growth, and the water holding capacity varies now throughout the gravel bed because some parts have lots of soil integrated, some don't. So it's a yeah, it's very variable what our water looks like. So it's hard to keep everything watered consistently. So we're moving to this new system, and we feel that'll work much better for the size of operation that we have. For a smaller gravel bed that you hand dig everything in, it wouldn't be a concern. But for us, this has become a concern. The biggest thing maybe for us is the price. We pay an average of $50 per tree. That's, you know, after I average everything out that we get in, usually it comes out to between $50 and $60 per tree, depending on the season. Some are 20, some are 80. It just goes depending on species. So if we were to purchase B&B stock or containerized at the level that we do, it would cost us, you know, maybe $50,000 more to $100,000 more per year just to get that stock in. And this has been a huge savings for us.
I think I always started with a pitchfork, but I was using kind of a standard manure fork, and then I began breaking tines or wooden handles, so then we welded a metal handle onto the pitchfork, which certainly added a lot of you know, prying ability, but again, the tines kept breaking, and that's when I looked at, well, what's the most heavy-dutyest, you know, badass pitchfork on the market? And I came across railroad ballast forks. Okay, so my main way of prying trees out manually is using this railroad ballast fork. I broke one tine off a few years ago, and then we took the wooden handle and then welded a heavy-duty metal handle onto it, and I painted it a unique color so I can find it better. And then I use this as kind of a pry bar, just a U-shaped piece of iron or steel. This is generally my method, is to throw the steel down perpendicular to the tree. We're going to try to take out a ginkgo. The pry bar idea I kind of thought of a couple years ago, just to add, you know, your basic mechanical leverage to the system. And between that old piece of iron and then just mower blades, you know, if you have any mower blades lying around that is not going to impact neighboring trees, that, you know, it seems like a nice link to use as kind of mechanical advantage. There we go. And then what I do is I normally wash the rock off with the hose, and then I dunk it in hydrogel. This is more just to keep the hydrogel clean. It's not so much that I want to have a perfectly clean root ball, but It's a 100-gallon tank hydrogel, or 100-gallon stock tank. I normally keep about 80 gallons of hydrogel, and then I add to it as the season goes on. In general, I try to keep one batch just because hydrogel is expensive, and unless it gets really nasty, there's no reason to swap it out. And you know, once we get into November, sometimes I have to break the ice. The top layer will freeze over a little bit. When it starts getting that cold, then I know that I'm not going to make a new batch of hydrogel. For trees that are harder to get out, or for trees that I can more easily access, I've decided to use these bobcat forks. These are called hydraulic forks. The distance between them is adjustable once you hook up the hydraulic lines. And as you'll see in a moment, what I'll do is I'll come in under the tree basically at the grade, under all the gravel, carefully go under the tree that I want to take out, and I just slowly lift up, very slowly, just so I'm not breaking any roots unnecessarily. And then that will, you know, makes quick work even at a slow pace of getting trees out, and all you're doing is pulling up on a joystick. As you can see, hand digging this would have taken a while. Very fibrous root system on Japanese tree lilacs. And in it goes. More or less often I have the two forks really close together just so that there's not a large gap between them as I lift them out. I cannot do this. I obviously cannot access every tree I have in the gravel bed with this, but on the long side and both one short side, I can access a lot. And obviously it makes short work of getting trees out, no matter how fibrous and extensive the root system may be.
How long has the Columbia Heights gravel bed been?
This is our inaugural year, first year of the gravel bed. The gravel bed itself was a donation from the Lions Club of Columbia Heights, a very generous donation, and then the rest was from the forestry budget. Think carefully about how you site it, how you're going to get the trees in and out. If I could go back and have my ideal situation, I would have machine accessibility from two sides of the gravel bed, or at a minimum from the longest side if it is not a square shape. If you have a rectangular shaped gravel bed, I would try hard to have machine access from the long side. And if not, think very carefully when you're putting them into the bed about your order, because that's going to determine the accessibility come fall. Church.
Starbuck, the city Starbuck?
Chris Starbuck from University of Missouri.
You can tell.
Missouri gravel bed. Yeah, I was reading some papers out of his lab and even emailed with him a little bit to ask him about. We got some interesting pot scale experiments adding calcined clay and getting doubling of the top growth and stuff. So they had never had anything published on like a larger scale. They were also looking into just using regular clay, and it said the preliminary results were comparable to calcined. Regular clay is $7 a ton. Calcined clay is $7.50 a ton or something. So the stuff they put on ball fields to keep it dry, like a baked clay product. So,
well, the main thing other than sand that I've experimented with is calcined clay. There was a period when I started to get interested in the effects of the irrigation water on pH in the gravel. And it appeared that over time you get a lot of calcium carbonate building up in the gravel, and the pH starts to creep up, and that's hard on certain species. So I got to thinking, well, what could I do about that? And the beauty of calcined clay is that it does have discrete particles because it's heated to a high temperature. and you can get different particle sizes. It's primarily used as an additive to improve infield drainage in baseball fields and that sort of thing. But it has a lot of cation exchange sites because it is a clay. And it also has a lot of internal pore space that can actually help it to hold water. So the theory was that, well, maybe if we mix in a certain amount of that, and then you fertilize with something like ammonium sulfate or some fertilizer, even a slow release that has a kind of a acidifying effect, that the calcined clay would help keep the pH from getting out of control, you know. So we played with that for quite a while, and I guess there are several problems. One, it's not cheap, and so if you add 10 or 15% calcined clay, it's going to add significant cost to the production system. Yeah, I've got two images. One showing what the gravel that I use looks like without any with the 10% sand, and then one where the calcined clay is mixed in at like 20%, just to show what it looks like. And you can see from my graphic there that the gravel that I tended to use was kind of angular. It was not river rock. It was from a slow moving stream in Missouri. So the particles are quite angular, as opposed to rounded like you'd have if you harvested the gravel from a fast flowing stream. So, you know, there are all sorts of different kinds of rock that you can use. But so that's one thing you can see from that graphic. And the other graphic, I've got 0, 10, 20, 30, and 40% calcined clay mixed in with the pea gravel with no sand. And it's just like a straight line graph. The more stuff you put in there, the taller, the more top growth you get. I think, besides the fact that it adds cost, I think you're really not trying to promote top growth. You're trying to promote root growth. And in some ways, the gravel with 10% sand, you know, regardless of this issue of pH, the gravel with the 10% sand has enough water holding capacity to do the job for most people's purposes. And it has sort of an air root pruning effect. I think you've got so much airspace in the mix that roots proliferate in those air spaces. You get 100% humidity in that area, and you don't have to have full root contact with every particle. And so I think it comes down to cost and availability of the materials that you have. And yeah, if you have a pH issue, then putting in a little bit of calcined clay might help manage the pH, but I'm not sure it justifies the benefits you get from root growth justify the extra expense. Another thing I did along those lines was that I had a pretty good sized gravel bed, and I had it on a slope, and it drained into a big sump. And so I just recirculated the irrigation with a sump pump. Used drip irrigation, and then I was able to adjust the pH of the water in the sump. We were using things like food grade ascorbic acid and just to put something in there that would have an effect on the pH without being toxic to the plants. And that actually worked pretty well. And it brings up another issue that, if you're not careful and you're just using pea stone and have no way to catch the water that you're putting on, you can end up with a pretty big water bill and a lot of runoff that you have to deal with, which could be an issue for some people. So if you can find a way to recirculate the irrigation water, that I know people are concerned about Phytophthora getting in there and having all potential for disease problems in your trees, but it really wasn't an issue for the bed that we were using in that way. And the interesting thing that I found was that if you looked at the quality of the water in the sump, it was really pure, because you get a lot of algae and bacterial film building up on the gravel particles, and it acts like kind of a biofilter. So the water you get in that sump ends up being pretty nice stuff. It's crystal clear, and you'd think it might get gunky, but it doesn't. It's kind of an interesting system.
So it's there was 36 cubic yards of buckshot or pea gravel, and then we added about 5 or 6. It was hard to be precise because it was just bucket loads. 5 or 6 yards of this sand fines mix. The sand fines mix is 80% sand, 20% fines, so silt and clay. So this thing is probably somewhere between 2 and 5% fines, somewhere between 5 and 10% sand, and the rest is pea gravel.
Yeah. Well, it would be interesting to see if other places are seeing top growth like you're seeing.
All right, look at my catalpa. I mean, you can see where it came off up there, where they clipped off the lead on the one closest to the building. Look at that. That's all this year's growth. That's like 30 inches. Look at the choke cherry. It's maybe 3.5 or 4 feet of growth. I mean, they're absurd. So, yeah, I'm really pleased with the way things turned out. The swamp whites just crushed it. You saw the roots on those. They were really good.
Our elms always look good. We've had really good luck with, as I was saying earlier, a new alder species that we got in, spathe alder, and the Manchurian alder seem to do really well when we got those in. They have just really intense root systems. Catalpa always seem to do really well. And as far as variability throughout the year, or throughout this different years, with some performing well, some not, I've get inconsistent results with Kentucky coffee tree. And I don't know if that's a stock issue or not, or sometimes I see roots that have really taken off, and then some that haven't. I haven't seen that translate to failure on the landscape or not, though, with limited root growth within the gravel bed.
Well, I think anything in the populus genus, along with elms, they do just fantastic. Male cottonwood, big-tooth aspen, St. Croix elm, Valley Forge elm, Accolade elms. They all do great. The tree lilacs do just fine. All the fruit trees I've had have done really well, both in the gravel and once in the landscape. The ones that haven't done so great, and I should also mention that a few years ago I had Russian olives, and those were the king of the gravel beds. They put on feet of growth in the gravel by itself. The ones that don't do so well, it seems like Ohio buckeye tends to struggle in the gravel, although that might have just been the positioning. River birch trees don't do so well once they're planted out. They do fine in the gravel, but they don't seem to like fall planting. Oaks, they just kind of sit there. Not swamp white oaks. Swamp white oaks produce great root systems in gravel, but bur oaks and some of the red oaks, they don't really grow much for roots, especially 6 feet and larger, and then hit or miss with outplanting them. Coffee trees are just fine in the gravel. I would say the only species that I specifically don't use in the gravel is river birch, and that's not because they don't do well in them, it's because that fall planting caveat. Honey locusts also sometimes have some dieback in the spring if they're planted in the fall, but they generally will recover with a vengeance. And you know, I got some bald cypress this year. They seem to love the gravel as well.
American elms are always a strong performer in everything except disease resistance, but the tulip poplars didn't do wonderfully. I guess I'm more familiar with the trees that weren't doing well because I ripped them out. Ones that did well, hackberries did well, blue beech did well, Kentucky coffee trees were successful.
Sure.
Don redwoods, they had wonderful gravel bed performance just to pick them off of a root system coming out. They had a little bit of dieback this winter, but came back strong after that. The oaks were really just topping the charts for poor gravel bed performance. They leafed out, well, a lot of them didn't leaf out at all, and if they did leaf out, they had these like miniature bonsai leaves, and then they died after that, so that didn't go great. The Ohio Buckeye root systems were not super fibrous, but they did well after that. They did well on establishment. The tulip poplars and the plane trees, kind of like the borderline zone 5 warmer trees, we had mixed success with. A lot of them were dying, but I think that's a situation where we just need to kind of keep trying them on a cheaper scale than buying potted or B&B trees, and see what they start taking.
Basically everything we've planted has done pretty well. There has been some variability between and within species. For root density, Japanese tree lilac and Amur chokecherry have really been our champs. And for top growth, we've seen a lot of that from the Amur chokecherries and even from the swamp white oaks, and in a couple rare instances from ironwood and then most of the catalpas as well. No, by and large, we've had really good performance from everything. Had one isolated incident where I lost 3 of 10 yellowwoods, but I don't think that was due to the gravel. I think they had problems coming in from the stock point of view. I really kind of leaned heavily on the recommended gravel bed species by performance, so there's nothing really unexpected in terms of performance.
And I've just had the stinkiest, horrible luck trying to get bur oaks to do well in gravel. But one of the things that I found is if I use, branched whips or branch liners, up to maybe 5 feet tall, they do really well in the gravel. But as soon as I get to calipered trees, even really as much as, less than an inch caliper, even, they just sit there. They don't do anything. They don't put out any fine roots, and it's usually a waste of time.
Do you have other species of trees that you would red flag as being difficult?
Difficult in different ways. I will never, ever in my life ever put willows in a gravel bed again. I'm way too old to try to get those things out of it.
I can relate.
Elms can be stinkers too, but my biggest, I learned so much from mistakes. My biggest mistake this year was I put in, I think 13 new species in the research beds out at the nursery. And one of those species was purple robe black locust. So I learned 2 things. Don't leave purple robes black locust in a gravel bed for more than, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 weeks. I had them in there for 12 weeks. So don't ever do that again. I had root growth on them that extended out beyond 8 feet. And then the second thing I learned is if you're going to be putting them in a gravel bed and leaving them very long, don't mix them in with other species, because they infiltrate all the other species' root systems too. the good part is it was really easy to see my mistake, because if you've ever seen black locust roots, they are canary yellow. So you can see, that's how I could tell they grew out so fast. And then I guess the third thing I learned is they're absolutely miserable, worse than willows, to try to get to lift out of a gravel bed. So anybody listening to this, do not put purple rolled black locust in a gravel bed for more than a month or so, and especially don't mix it in with other species. Learn that one the hard way.
What about honey locust?
Honey locust does, we found it does really, really well. Honey locust performs well. Coffee tree performs really, really well. I think one of the problems with coffee trees is when you harvest, if you don't get every single piece of woody root, they'll shoot off of those woody roots. And so you have a bed of coffee trees forever and ever. They just keep coming back. And you can keep harvesting them, forever and ever too, but they do really, really well. What I found interesting are the Freeman maples, because I've run probably 5 or 6 different varieties of Freeman maples through there, and some of them, Sienna Glen does pretty darn well. But this year I used Marmo, which is touted for being more drought and heat resistant. Good grief, the root systems they produced were just mops of root. It was fantastic. And Autumn Blaze does really well too. One of the things that it kind of goes up and down year after year is Ohio Buckeye. And I've had Ohio Buckeye in there for a season, and I harvest them, and good grief, the roots look pretty much like they did when I installed them in the spring. And I plant them out. In the next year, they look beautiful. I have 100% survival, even though they didn't put out roots. This year, we put in calipered Ohio Buckeyes, and good grief, the root systems they produced, it were, again, just mops of roots. So, can't figure it out. Like I said, I wish I was younger. But the interesting thing is, even when they don't produce many roots in a gravel bed, it's like they're in a holding pattern. And as soon as you get them in the ground, boom, they take off. So can't complain about that. Then the last one, which has been a terrible frustration of mine, has been silver linden, Tilia tomentosa. I've had terrible luck with that in the gravel beds. Actually, I haven't had terrible luck. I've had no luck with it in the gravel beds. It is kind of funny and interesting, all the different species responses, but those are the ones. Amelanker is kind of middle of the road, doesn't go berserk with root systems, but transplants out well. And we transplant out as late as, I guess my record for planting out from gravel bed was 2 years ago, and I pulled and planted December 6th was the last batch of trees. And I had almost 100% survival. I wouldn't recommend doing that.
We first load up the back of a 1-ton pickup with some mulch, which we then wet down thoroughly, and then we start extracting the trees in the reverse order that we're going to plant them, and we stand them up in the bed, sort of plant them in the mulch, if you will, and then re-water them down, and then we put a strap across to the back of the cab to hold the trees vertical while we head to location. And then we'll head out to the planting site, and we have a tractor or a skid steer with a 36-inch tapered tree-style auger bit that we use to drill the holes. And then we have our mulch with us just in the back of the truck. We use it as we go.
So we have some 55-gallon tree pots that we got in. that work fantastic. So what we do is we bring a load of mulch with us, and we lay out these 55-gallon pots along our planting at the holes and put the bare root tree in each of the pots, and then come and fill those up with mulch as we go along. Once we put the tree in, we dump another pot of mulch over that tree and then soak the mulch. So now that tree, bare root tree, which is very perishable, becomes much more or less perishable. That can sit out on the road while we explain how to plant a tree to volunteers, and until the volunteers get there. That tree is gonna stay moist and ready for planting, so we don't have any issues with that. Previously we had, when especially a large volunteer planting, you try to get the trees to the people, but you can't leave them there because the root systems will start to dry out, and the last trees of the plantings, they look like they're already going. So we've employed this method now for a couple of years, and we think it really works. It works for us. And it takes a little bit more prep, and we have some cleanup afterwards, but the nice thing is the mulch is at the hole then. So once they plant the tree, they just dump that bucket of mulch right on the tree, and you've already taken care of that mulching. So I guess in essence, you don't have much more work because you had the mulch tree anyways.
So we got a machine called a toolcat. It's a very versatile machine. It goes up to about 19 miles an hour. So you can tool down the road. It has the less than 25 mile an hour triangle on the back, so it's designed for road travel. And all the attachments that can fit on a bobcat can fit on a toolcat. And in my case, the two most important attachments are that adjustable forks, and then I have a 36-inch bit auger, that tree planting bit as it's called. It's about 18 inches wide at the bottom, and then it flares out to 36 inches wide, which I use for augering out holes for tree planting. Can't use that on every site, especially if there's an old stump or if there's electricity or communication cables right under where I have to plant, but I'd say about 80 to 90% of the sites I'm able to use that, and that makes short work of the whole planting process. Backfilling is the most laborious part of the endeavor then when you have the auger, and that's nothing compared to having to do the other way around, excavating by hand. So the auger is a very, very nice tool to have, and it creates what can be a one-person planting operation. Throw the trees in the back along with the gator bags and the tools, and then you have the tree planting auger in the front. So you can just do all this on your own and with minimal extra staff. And I understand probably for larger cities it'd be easier to have 2 or 5 or more people, but maybe in the age of COVID-19 it's easier to do it as a one-person job as well. So we've used this auger system since we got in 2016, so the first year I was here I had to plant the trees by hand, but since 2016 I've been using the auger to dig most of the holes where I plant.
Gravel bed are by and far the easiest trees to plant, and you don't need to bring any soil on site, you don't need to bring any equipment on site. If you have a person and a shovel, you can get them in. We've had like blocks of concrete in old dump sites, and we've had stumps, and you can just, because you're dealing with just the root system, you can work it around obstacles like you can at all with a ball and burlap or a potted tree. Yeah. They go in quick and easy, and they seem to require less staking for whatever reason than some other trees, but I'm super happy with them. The system of buying the trees in the spring and then planting them in the fall requires a lot more planning ahead. So for the tree crews replacement and bolstering our street tree program, the gravel bed works because we can plan ahead with that. But for project installation and more like landscape design, they've discussed using gravel bed trees, but it requires a lot more front-end planning. The way we can transport the trees, it's less of a concern of keeping them wet. We got the water truck right here, and we're only driving like 5 to 10 minutes tops between sites. Our gravel bed is on the other side of those buildings. Last year we had brute containers full of water strapped to a truck that we would transport the trees in. That presented some problems though, just because they're standing pretty upright. and we got a lot of stem rub on the side of the containers. But they seem to be doing pretty well with just keeping them dripping wet with the water truck in transport and during planting.
It also it allows for watering. We don't have watering in the budget, so that led to a lot of mortality in those spring planted bare roots. We were relying on homeowners to water, and if they didn't comply, the trees were dying basically 100% of the time. So this allows us to get a full season of watering in, centralized in an affordable fashion. Watering these 200 trees for the entire season is going to cost the forestry budget just over $200, which is basically 2 man-hours driving the watering truck. So we're able to provide full water for a season for pennies.
I would say that it's a great system for any kind of municipal planting. If you can find a place to have it in kind of a more secure location, once it's set up, you're good to go. You know, it's planting at the right depth. There's no worries about that. And you know, again, the cost is a major driving, I think would be a major incentive because of the cost of each individual tree. You do seem to have a minimum order these days, but again, I guess being how cheap the trees are, if you don't get to use them all, well, you're not out of thousands and thousands of dollars.
One thing gravel beds have allowed for us to do is to experiment with trees normally found in more southern ranges. And we're, you know, when we're bringing trees in at $50 per stem, we're able to experiment with some of these a lot more without a big financial risk. So if we bring in 5 Katsura, you know, we're not on the hook for a couple of $1,000s. We've maybe, you know, got 500 into it, maybe 250, maybe less, depending on the size. So then we can plant those trees out in our facilities and our roadways, and then we can find out what works for us. And that's been really helpful. We've found some trees that do okay, that we wouldn't have normally been able to get unless we had, you know, wholesale size orders. And we found that Turkish hazelnut do really well. So we've been able to experiment with some of these trees that we normally wouldn't have been able to maybe even get if we were just purchasing a few at a time.